Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the November edition of the Ag Economic Dialogue session. We had a little bit of change up due to some scheduling and some of those types of things. So one presenter today covering a couple topics, but I think that'll be all right. So as always, we will open the whole conversation up to questions throughout the presentation if you'd like. Otherwise, towards the end, we'll take the recording off and you can ask your questions there as we go forward. So type them into the chat or unmute your microphone if you have questions as we go through. Sarah Sellars has joined us today. So Sarah, welcome to the program again, and I will turn it over to you.
Well, good morning. Thank you so much, Heather, for that introduction. And hello and good morning to everybody. I'm really excited to be here. I've presented a few times at the beginning of the year, and then now I'm going to get to present to you here in November, and you're going to get stuck with a double dose of me because I'm going to talk a little bit about the Farm Bill, conservation funding, some of these policy changes that you might have some interest in, and tell you all the latest of what's going on with that. And then about halfway through, I'm going to switch topics to talk about a research project I've had going on called Data Intensive Farm Management, which is using your precision equipment to perform experiments on your own field, using your own data, trying to optimize whatever input of your choice. So I'm going to show you some results for 2 trials we did here in South Dakota. One of them, we were trying to find the optimal soybean seeding rate. And the other trial, we were optimizing 2 inputs. So we were trying to find the optimal UAN rate. And then we were trying to test out Pivot Bio, which is a biological nitrogen product. So I'm going to show you the results from that. As Heather mentioned, feel free to jump in with any questions, any comments at any point in the discussion. I'd like to keep things pretty informal, so please don't be shy. You know, if there's a slide that piques your interest or brings up a question, feel free to type it in or shout it out. I like to talk, so feel free to jump in, and we can make sure all the questions get answered. Okay, so first let's start with policy, which has been quite a ride over the last month, as you all have probably been following in the news. In my presentation today, I'm going to focus on the crop production side. Not much, I don't have much on the livestock side, but I do recognize that's an important part of agriculture here in South Dakota. These are kind of the main questions that I think are probably at the forefront of minds. Will there be more government payments? Will we have a farm bill this year? And what policy changes could affect farmers? So that's what I'm going to try to answer for you. So my main takeaways are, as you probably know, net farm income is down due to lower commodity prices and higher input prices. We've seen a bit of recent optimism with the increase in soybean prices, but we're still kind of stuck in this margin squeeze and some of these trade challenges that we've been facing for some time now. Will the ag economy turn around? I don't see any indicators that in the short run it will, unless we see some sort of unexpected supply or demand shock. Will there be more government payments? Maybe. Is that a good thing? Not necessarily, but you know, we'll just be matter of fact and talk about what's happening, but whether that's a overall good or bad thing is a different story. We could talk about that a little bit too. And will there be a farm bill this year? So we know for sure that that's a no, that got extended for another year, the 2018 Farm Bill. So as I mentioned, we've been seeing a period of lower commodity prices compared to other periods in history. And what makes this time period different compared to 2015 to 2020, when we saw lower prices, is we now have higher input costs. So this is putting more of a squeeze on margins. So the previous period when we had lower prices, we had lower input cost, and it was able to offset some of those challenges, as well as we had a lot of government payments then as well. especially during the coronavirus food assistance program and some of those other programs we saw during that time. But now we've come into a period of lower prices, higher input costs, which has put our farmers in a more of a margin squeeze for all commodities, corn, soybeans, and wheat, which are our main commodities here in South Dakota. And this is projected to continue into the long term. So these are the World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates. These were just released in November, so that they're projecting what the price of these commodities will be over the 2025-2026 crop year. So here's their price projections. They've come up for soybeans a bit from what we've seen before. Wheat and corn have gone down a little bit. So we are seeing a bit of optimism in the soybean price and the soybean market, but right now it's not enough to offset some of those margin challenges we're seeing with increased input costs. When could we expect things to improve or change? Right now, I don't see any indicators of short-run improvement. There's a lot of optimism with trade, but I think a lot of that is cautious optimism as we're still waiting to kind of see what happens with some of these trade deals. There's been talk of a EU trade deal, which would be announced at the beginning of the year. So any of these trade deals coming through could improve prices even some more. For the input costs, one of the main things to watch is the interest rates. So as the price of all inputs have gone up, one of the main prices that's gone up is the interest rate. So that really affects the budget. So if we saw rates come down, we've seen them come down a bit, but if we see them come down even more, this would lower input costs. The strength of the dollar. So the dollar has been pretty strong for the last couple of years, which is good for the US, but it's interesting because agriculture usually runs kind of counter-cyclical to the US economy. So when the dollar is weaker, our commodities are cheaper for other countries to purchase, so then they purchase more of them. But when the dollar is stronger, then they have less buying power, so then maybe they'll look to other countries where they can get the commodities cheaper, such as South America. So if we were to see the dollar weaken, this could increase the demand for our commodities, which would increase the commodity price. Again, as I mentioned, if we saw some trade agreements or tariffs come through, that could create some positive changes in the ag economy. Or if we saw some sort of policy change in biofuels, there's been some talk about this, but some sort of policy to create more demand for commodities or increase biofuel use, or some sort of technological development to, use more biofuels. This could increase demand in the market. Another thing to watch is weather in the US and South America. So Brazil is just closing out a really strong soybean harvest. So they're able to get two, even sometimes 3 crops a year. So how the weather and yields turn out down there affects our markets here, and their trading relationship with China affects our markets here. So that's another factor to watch. Now I want to talk a little bit about what we're seeing on the policy side, on the government payment side. So we had the One Big Beautiful Bill, which passed July 4th. So this continues agricultural risk coverage and price loss coverage. These are our shallow loss programs. So these are direct payments to farmers for shallow losses that they suffer during the marketing year. And when I say shallow loss, I'm talking about more than 85%, above 85% of your revenue. So you have your crop insurance, which typically covers, some percentage of your yield or revenue, usually up to 85%. With some of these new endorsements, we're seeing all the way up to even 95%, but we're going to stick to about 85%. And then shallow loss would be that 15% above your crop insurance policy that's not covered. So that's what these ARC and PLC programs are designed to cover. They're designed to trigger payments in years where crop insurance, you might have 85% coverage from crop insurance, but you suffer some shallow losses, and then they would make direct direct payments to you, depending on which program you chose as well, ARC or PLC, due to a recent change in which was passed in the One Big Beautiful Bill. For the 2025 crop year, farmers will receive either the higher of ARC or PLC. So your choice does not end up mattering for that year. So for each covered commodity, you'll just receive whatever's higher. I'm going to show you the projected payment for those for South Dakota. Some other things that changed through that bill were that the farm payment limits increased from $125,000 to $155,000. So there's usually a cap on how much total payments you can receive from the government. So they increased that a bit. In the past, they forbid you from enrolling in some of these crop insurance endorsements that cover shallow losses, and our county or these other programs designed to cover shallow losses. So they did away with that requirement. So now you can enroll in supplemental coverage option and our county both if you want, which is a new change. And then as far as we know, for the 2026 crop year, you're going to have to choose between ARC or PLC again, unless there's some sort of change between now and the enrollment date. So these are the 2024 estimated ARC PLC payments. We don't have that data released yet, so these are just projections, but you would have received these payments in October 2025. And as you can see for South Dakota, we see some payments for corn and soybeans mostly being triggered in the western part of the state. In the eastern and central part of the state, we don't see a lot of, and this is at the county level, so we don't see a lot of county level payments being triggered. There's a little bit of soybean payments in the northeast corner of South Dakota and a few counties in southeast South Dakota. But other than that, most of the payments are being triggered in the western part of the counties, western part of the state, and most of those payments are fairly low. So somewhere between $0 and $35 per acre. This is for 2024. And again, these would already be being paid in October of 2025. So that's one of the challenges with these shallow loss programs, is there's usually some sort of lag between when the payments are triggered and when the payments are actually paid. So it's usually 1 year later. And then these are the projected payments for 2025. So for this upcoming year for South Dakota. And again, you can see there's more payments expected to be triggered in eastern South Dakota this time. But you can see from the shading on those, that's pretty light. So that ranges from about $36 to $50 an acre, which is not nothing. But if we look at other parts of the United States, particularly the southern commodities, cotton, rice, and peanuts, you can see that a lot of those counties are $86 an acre or more. So there's really heavy payments triggered in those regions and across some of the Midwest as well. So you can see some of that darker red area across Nebraska, Iowa, and Illinois compared to what we're seeing in South Dakota. So that's what you can expect for 2025 for ARC and PLC payments. And again, those won't be paid until October 2026. So there's that lag period where we have to kind of wait and hang on financially until that time. There's also been a variety of direct payments paid out. As I mentioned, direct payments are controversial. They're not necessarily a good thing. There's some evidence that they distort the markets, that they distort input markets, that they can distort the land market, that whenever farmers are paid direct payments, then some of this gets passed through to the landowner. If the farmer's cash renting the land, it could get passed through the form of higher cash rents. So there's a lot of challenges with this, and it's really challenging because the kind of policy and market has evolved to expect and incorporate these, and it can have some distortionary effects. So just because I'm talking about it doesn't mean that I think that it's good or agree with it, but it is what it is. So this is the data of what's been paid out and what we can expect. So I think it's something we need to to talk about. But again, just because we're talking about it doesn't mean that it's a net positive effect on the economy, especially when some of those payments can be passed through the farmer and have unintended consequences for land prices and input prices. So we saw 3 programs: the Supplemental Disaster Relief Program, the Emergency Commodity Assistance Program, and the Emergency Livestock Relief Program. So I just detailed a little bit about those and those amounts. So the only one that's currently open right now is the Supplemental Disaster Relief Program. It consists of 2 stages. The first stage, if you're going to receive payments from the first stage, a lot of you have probably already taken care of that or received those. So that was for indemnified losses using federal crop insurance or non-insured crop disaster data. And then the stage 2 just recently opened up, and both of these stages are open until April 30th, 2026. So you could talk to your local FSA office, and you could still enroll in either of these. But stage 2 just recently opened up, and it covers producers with non-indemnified, uncovered, and quality losses. So you can check and see if you're eligible for that. So that's currently the only direct payment program open right now. There's been a lot of talk of some additional direct payments, especially during some of these trade challenges we've been seeing. And during the government shutdown, we heard a lot of questions, a lot of discussion about another trade aid package for farmers, a direct payment package for farmers. Now that we've seen some improvement in the soybean market and some kind of some slight optimism toward trade, I think some of that talk has backtracked a bit, but it's still up for discussion. So this was just yesterday that the USDA Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation said that they are still considering making direct payment to crop farmers for trade disruptions. They said that the USDA chief economist's office is actually looking at it right now, analyzing the market impacts and seeing whether it's necessary. So they're trying to get the full financial picture of what's going on before they actually decide whether or not to make the payments. But there has been a lot of talk of more direct payments because of these trade disruptions. Whether or not that will come to fruition, I'm not sure. Now, when it comes to the Farm Bill, I've been answering the question, will we have the Farm Bill this year, for probably 3 years now. So now I have an actual answer for 2025, which is no, because the Farm Bill's been extended for another year, the 2018 Farm Bill. So we're going to keep that in place. But what's kind of interesting is a lot of those provisions that are traditionally in the Farm Bill were actually moved out of the Farm Bill and funded through the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So the Farm Bill is a bit thinner than it used to be because some of those were taken out and funded through 2031 through the One Big Beautiful Bill. So for example, the ARC, PLC, and marketing assistance loans, those are all funded through 2031 crop year by the One Big Beautiful Bill, which was passed July 4th, 2025. And some of these other conservation programs that are typically negotiating points in the Farm Bill, these were all also extended through the One Big Beautiful Bill until 2031. So some of that uncertainty that we always face where, we're trying to reach an agreement and there's a possibility that some of these things might revert back to the original language of previous bills. We won't have to worry about that because some of these were funded through the One Big Beautiful Bill, so that alleviates some of that uncertainty. So we won't have to worry about that as much. And as I mentioned, so this continuing resolution bill, this was the bill that reopened the government after the government was shut down. This also extended the 2018 Farm Bill and extended funding for the USDA for another year. So usually at the end of the year, we have this kind of pinch where we're trying to figure out what to do with the Farm Bill, whether something's going to get passed. There's always a probability things could expire and that we revert back to 1940s law. And that's just not what's happening this year because of all these policy changes being made within other legislation, which has taken some of that burden out of making those through the Farm Bill. So as we're talking about the Farm Bill over the next year, you can expect it to be people are calling it a thin farm bill because some of these big talking points and changes for agriculture that we usually see up for discussion in the farm bill have been taken out or alleviated already. So there won't be as much to go over, but there will still be discussion about the farm bill to watch in the upcoming year. So that's the policy presentation, and that's kind of the latest of what's going on with government payments, with farm bill, with changes from the One Big Beautiful Bill, with the government reopening and what you can expect from that. So if you have any questions about that part of the presentation, feel free, again, type them in the chat or shout them out. Happy to give you the best answer I can for any of these policy questions, especially during these uncertain times. But I think it's important to keep watching for the latest information and how it can affect farmers and ranchers and the people in our state. So again, happy to take any questions, or feel free to ask them during the end too, or jump in the chat at any point in time. All right, so I'll go ahead and jump into my second topic, which is called Economically Optimal Inputs, Results from an On-Farm Nitrogen Biological Product and Soybean Seeding Trial. So this is a project I'm involved in. It's called Data Intensive Farm Management. This is a project led by David Bullock, who's an agricultural economist at the University of Illinois. And he has collaborators all across the world implementing his system and using his software to design trials. So I was part of this program. I helped with two trials here in South Dakota that I want to talk to you a little bit about and share some results about, because I think you might find them interesting, and maybe you or someone you know would be interested in participating in data intensive farm management. So traditionally, we've had this push and pull between profit versus yield maximization. So historically, we've seen a lot of push towards getting the highest crop yields possible, optimizing yields. But when we think about what the actual production looks like at the profitability level, usually the optimal yield and the optimal profit are two different numbers. So usually there's a point. And here I show this on this was an extension publication by Anthony Bly. This is the optimal nitrogen rate here in South Dakota for this data based on this idea of diminishing returns. So after a certain point, we reach optimal, and then after that, we may be getting higher yield, but we're actually, the amount of money we're spending on nitrogen is not paying off. It's not paying for the yield increase, so we're getting diminishing marginal returns. So then the optimal profit is actually somewhere here, further back on the curve. And this number, like I mentioned, is not the optimal yield typically. Usually those are two different numbers. So something that we've been trying to work on, many scientists for a long time, is trying to shift the mindset from thinking about yield maximization and getting the highest yields possible to thinking about profit maximization and how can we optimize inputs and use all of our resources as efficiently as possible to get the highest profit possible. So with precision ag, we've got a lot of tools that can help us to do that, but a lot of those aren't being fully utilized. So that's one of the reasons that David started this project. And the idea of data intensive farm management is that, we have a lot of different universities and companies running field trials, but maybe your field doesn't look quite like what the trial field looks like. Probably your field looks something like this, where it has different sections, and different areas of your field probably respond differently to inputs. So for example, this area A here, on the x-axis of this chart, we have nitrogen. On the y-axis, we have yield. And then this curve here we see is the function. This is the yield response to nitrogen, which is a function of the nitrogen rate and the weather. So we can see the yield response to nitrogen for area A, this curve. It looks very different than the yield response to nitrogen for area B of the field, or area C of the field. For example, with area C, it's pretty flat. So we could keep applying more and more and more nitrogen, and we're not really getting a strong yield response. Whereas in area A, we would want to apply a higher rate of nitrogen if we want to get a higher yield. And again, this is it. First, right now we're just talking about yield optimization, but we'll also talk about profit optimization too. Or for example, if we look at the yield response curve in area D, it's really curved. So you reach a point about the middle of the curve where, applying more nitrogen actually negatively affects your yield. So the idea David had was to conduct trials on farmers' own fields using farmers' own data and precision equipment to try to find the optimal yield and also the economically optimal input levels for your field using your data, using your own experiment. So it's been a really interesting project to be part of, and it's really led by the farmers. So you work with someone from data intensive farm management. You tell them, what input you want to optimize. It can be anything. It can be your seeding rate. It can be a nutrient. It can be testing a product. Like in our trials, we tested Pivot Bio. It's a biological product. It's designed in theory to unlock some of the nitrogen in the soil so that you have to apply less nitrogen. So the farmer wanted to test and see if it worked on his field. So we were able to do that using this data intensive farm management system. And then you're able to get a lot of data and maps of what your economically optimal rates look like. And then they do a comparison between, okay, if I applied a uniform rate, if I applied a uniform seeding rate, and I apply the economically optimal, how much money would I gain or lose from doing this? So it helps you find the optimal on your own field, and it also helps you think about these problems really practically from a profit standpoint. So this is just a little more about the idea that traditionally we've had these trials where we vary inputs and then we create this yield response curve to try to see find what that curve looks like. So we're going to have to vary inputs, try different rates. And again, this might be on a trial or example field. So it's not on may not be on your actual field even. So for example, you can look at different soil types and try to find the optimal response curve for each of those. But the problem we run into is when you get data like this. So if you don't have enough variation in your nitrogen rate, maybe all the yield data you collect will look like this, and then there's not enough data or response to fit this curve of what the yield response looks like. So to solve this, what we're trying to do is make your recommendations site specific. So you can vary your seeding rate all across the field. So maybe one area of your field, the optimal soybean seeding rate is 90,852. And in other parts of your field, maybe it's 102,293. So we have the technology and the precision equipment to do that. And what we want to do is we want to use your data, use an experiment of your design, where we sit down with the farmer says what their status quo rate is. So for example, this farmer said, what their typical soybean seeding rate is. And then they gave us a range of what they think their soybean seeding rate varies from. So we have the upper and lower bound. And then we develop, 4 or 5 different levels to test. And we test that all across your field and try to find the optimal seeding rate for every region. So this is what the trial design looks like. We did a soybean seeding rate trial for this farmer. So we were varying the application from 90,000 to 140,000 seeds an acre. And then we designed a block trial like this. So the precision equipment will automatically place the seeds in the block trial all across the field. So our hope or what we want is we want every combination of every trial and every input, every slope, every soil type. So then we can aggregate and analyze all of that data. And then we have every combination on your field that's possible when we think about soil type, when we think about the trial rates, things like that. So this is what the trial we designed looked like, the soybean seeding rate trial. This was in eastern South Dakota. So we worked with the farmer to, as I mentioned, design the upper and lower bound and what he thought the optimal rate was. And then we implemented the trial, and then we used his harvest data to find out what the actual optimal rate is. So we have a network all across the US and even the world. They have some trials going on in South America as well. So Jason Clark and I are the two from South Dakota State University that are working with farmers to implement these trials, but they're collecting data from all across the US. So it's really interesting, some of these projects they have going on. So then the farmer gets a report that contains all of their profitability data, all of their yield data, economically optimal input rates, optimal yields. You get everything. So it's a lot of information, but I tried to pull out some of the most relevant pieces to talk about from this trial. So you can see here that we have the average as planted seeding rate on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have the mean yield. The orange line is the average profit, and the blue line is the average yield. So we can actually see that the highest average yield and the highest average profit was actually the lowest average as planted seeding rate, which was 90,852. And as we moved into some of these higher seeding rates, like the 124,948, we actually saw significantly lower profit and lower yield. So again, these are just averages, so we can't make a strong statement using these averages, but the farmer will receive all of this data to look at and to think about. And then we can also break it out by different characteristics of the field. So for example, this was the elevation level. We can look at the mean yields and profit at different levels of elevation. We can look at the mean yield and profit looking at different soil type. That's the map on the right. So we can see how, for example, most of their soil was Brookings silty clay loam. So we can see how that performs profitability and yield-wise under different soybean seeding rates. So the farmer will receive this full report where they can go over all this data and look at the individual effect at the field level. But what we're really interested here is the economically optimal soybean seeding rate. So this is the main output of the report, which is the optimal soybean seeding rate, and then the farmer gives us a soybean price and a soybean cost. So he tells us what he paid for the soybean seed, and then we enter the soybean price and we find the economic optimal, and we try to calculate whether planting at the economically optimal uniformly or site specifically would be more profitable. So on this trial, if the farmer had planted at the optimal uniform rate, which he was very close. So he gives us what he thinks his optimal uniform rate is, and then we test it. So he was really close to what his actual optimal rate was. But if he had done the optimal rate over the whole field, it would have increased his profits by $32.70 per acre. Or if he had done this map on the left, which is planting the site-specific optimal rate, this would have raised his profits by $33.91 per acre. So you can see there's not much difference for this trial between the optimal uniform rate and the optimal site-specific rate. Probably it's not really, you're not getting a huge financial gain from varying that rate site-specifically. So you can actually have the data to verify that and think about that. And another thing to keep in mind is this is just 1 year of data. So as the farmer participates in more years of trials and we see what happens over time, we'll be able to more confidently say what the optimal site-specific and uniform rates are, because we have the weather variable that we need to account for, of course. So getting a few more years of data, we'll be able to say this more confidently. But these are the type of results and outputs we're producing and sharing with the farmer to help them think about this decision. Our next trial that the farmer wanted to do was a Pivot Bio and UAN trial. So this was a challenging trial because there were actually, this was a 2-input trial. So we were optimizing 2 inputs at the same time. We wanted to find the optimal UAN rate, and then we also wanted to test Pivot Bio. So the farmer was applying Pivot Bio at a rate of 5 gallons on some parts of the field and 0 on others. And we wanted to test whether that Pivot Bio, whether he wanted to know basically whether there was an effect. So we could test that for him. This trial was really complicated to design because of this 2 inputs. So we had to do a custom design. So typically your DIFM person and the farmer will sit down together. We'll go into the online system and we'll design your trial together. But this trial actually had to be custom designed by the data intensive farm management team because we had this interaction between the UAN and the Pivot Bio. So it wasn't fair if we applied UAN and Pivot Bio to a site, then it wasn't fair to compare that to a site with UAN and Pivot Bio. So we had to vary the nitrogen rates, factoring with and without the Pivot Bio, so that those would end up being the same rates when we accounted for that Pivot Bio. So that's how we came up with this trial design. I know it's a little overwhelming, but we had to do this because we wanted to make it as fair and unbiased as possible. So we couldn't apply more nitrogen to one square in theory and then compare it with a square with no Pivot Bio. It's not a fair trial. So we're very deliberate in how we design this trial. Another thing to mention is that there's a no loss guarantee. So we understand that there's some risk to experimenting with these things. And at the end of the trial, we calculate compared to the status quo, whether the farmer made or lost money. And if the farmer loses money on trying one of these experiments, then they receive compensation from the project. So that loss is calculated, and then the farmer receives that compensation, and then they also receive a small stipend to say thank you for participating. So this helps alleviate some of the risk because we know there is some risk to trying these products, trying out these trials, and trying different nutrient or seeding rates. So these were our results from the Pivot Bio and UAN trial. So it's a little bit hard to see. I think the next table will be more interesting. But so we were able to find the optimal site-specific UAN rate. On the left is where there's no UAN no Pivot Bio on the UAN trial, and on the right is where there is Pivot Bio. So this on the right is the optimal site-specific UAN rate with Pivot Bio, and on the left is the optimal site-specific UAN rate without Pivot Bio. So, and then to compare the Pivot Bio and no Pivot Bio, we looked at the mean profits. So on the left, we have the average UAN rates. And again, these rates with no Pivot Bio theoretically should be the same as the lower UAN rates plus Pivot Bio with the nitrogen that Pivot Bio is delivering. So on the right, we have that same. So the 5 is the 5 gallons of Pivot Bio, the 27 is the UAN. So that's comparable to the no Pivot Bio and 40 UAN. So you can see the mean yield with no Pivot Bio again, and we're taking all those little squares all across the field and aggregating them together. So we capture all different soil types, all different topographies. So basically what we found is the trials with no Pivot Bio and the UAN rate of 50 had the highest average profit. This was $705 per acre, which was higher than any of the mean profits for the Pivot Bio trial. And again, this factors in the cost of the Pivot Bio, it factors in the cost of the UAN, and it factors in the corn price that the farmer gave us. So So we didn't see we didn't see any economic advantage to using the pivot bio. We did see some difference in the UAN. So if the farmer had used the optimal UAN rate in the no pivot bio trial, it would have raised their profit by $11 an acre. In the pivot bio trial, if they had used the optimal UAN rate, it would have raised their profit by $8 an acre. Another thing to keep in mind is that this data is very valuable and sensitive. So we're collecting all of the farmers' precision data. It's stored within the DIFM system. It's not sold or transferred. The only thing we do with it is research. So there's been a lot of publications and extension articles written about these trials and the results we're seeing, but it's important to know that we're not sharing this farmer data with anyone except the public. This is a little bit more about data-intensive farm management. The project's led by David Bullock at the University of Illinois. That's him on the right. He's the project director. And then here at SDSU, myself and Jason Clark are both involved with the data-intensive farm management project. So Jason is an assistant professor and extension soil fertility specialist. So if you want to learn more about the data-intensive farm management and what we're working on, you can visit their website at difm.farm. Or if you or someone you know are interested in conducting a trial or setting up a trial, you can talk with myself, you can talk with Jason, or you can reach out to David Bullock, the project director. Another thing I wanted to mention is that our ag economic team is working on putting together a survey that we're going to send out to all of you. It's very short, only 4 questions, and we just want to gather some feedback about our ag economic dialogues, about the topics, about your thoughts, to help us shape future topics and improve the program. So this is just a note to keep an eye out in your inbox. We're going to be sending that out here before long, and we'd really value your feedback and what you had to say about our dialogues. Anything you're willing to provide and tell us will help us to improve and to make changes that will shape the dialogues and make them more valuable to you and to what you want. So from our whole Nest School of Management and Economics Extension team, I just wanted to say thank you in advance for keeping a lookout for our survey. And please, if you see that come through your inbox, please take a minute to fill that out, because we will read it and we will use your feedback. So I just want to wrap up by sharing my contact information. I have plenty of time to take questions now, or you can reach out to me by email or calling me if you have more questions, or if you want to know more about any of the topics I discussed today. Also, just wanted to wish everyone a very happy Thanksgiving next week, and really grateful that you're here and really grateful for this opportunity to present today. So happy to open the floor up for any questions.
Thanks, Sarah. That was very informational and enlightening. So, yeah, very good presentations.